Mike Whale, Secretary of the Hull branch of the Socialist Party. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Erem.
Thank you. So, what do you understand by the term the Kurdish question?
Well, I take it to mean the history of the oppression of the Kurdish people by various imperial powers and local powers stretching back over centuries, actually, but right up to the present day, with in particular the attacks that are taking place by Turkey on Rojava and on the Kurds within Turkey.
Also, Turkey is on headlines again with other violation of human rights, the removal of parliamentary membership of 2 HDP MPs and 1 CHP MP. How would you comment about that?
Well, it's an absolute disgrace. And I think the first point I want to make is that the British and international labour movement needs to protest very strongly about these arrests and about this abuse of power by Erdogan within Turkey itself. Whole Trades Council has already sent a message of protest to the Turkish embassy, and we're encouraging our affiliates to do the same. But in terms of what it symbolises, in some ways, I think this shows that Erdogan has a very weak position in Turkey, and I think this is in response to the growing opposition that is clearly developing on the ground. We're hearing reports that, for example, the way that he's managed the coronavirus has meant that many workers have been forced to go into work and have actually responded by walking off the sites that they're on and defying Erdogan in that sense. So the general support for him, our perception is that it's beginning to disintegrate, and he's forced to rely more and more on dictatorial measures such as this.
Mr. Abdullah Ocalan is under isolation last 21 years now, and he has not been able to meet his basic human rights. So what is Turkish state aims by isolating Mr. Abdullah Öcalan?
Well, I think Mr. Ocalan is seen by the Kurdish people and also actually by the international labour movement as the leader of the Kurdish people. In some ways, he has a position very similar to that of Nelson Mandela, who also was imprisoned for decades by the apartheid regime in South Africa. And just as there was an international campaign for the release of Mandela, so also I think that the labour movement internationally needs to take up Mr. Öcalan's imprisonment and demand that the Turkish regime release him. So I think it's yet another example of the Turkish state's refusal to really enter into any kind of democratic dialogue about the way forward. But what I'd also point out is this, that complicit in his arrest and imprisonment is every single one of the European so-called liberal democracies. They delivered Mr. Öcalan up to the Turkish state. None of them would give him asylum, which is written into many of their constitutions, including Germany, including Holland, including Italy, and even Britain, and even Greece, which of course historically is a rival of Turkey. Effectively was complicit in the delivery of Mr. Öcalan to the Turkish state forces in Tanzania, I think it was, in Africa, where he was seeking asylum at that particular point. So, and the reason I make that point is because I think in terms of Mr. Öcalan's position and the Kurdish struggle, that they cannot rely on even so-called liberal capitalist, democratic capitalist states in the West for their cause. And I think that's a really important point to make.
How important is women's liberation for the Middle East, and can the Kurdish women's movement play a real role in achieving it?
Well, the women's liberation movement in the Middle East is going to be very, very important. Women will play a major role in the liberation of society, and the Kurdish women's movement has been absolutely inspirational, particularly the way in which within Rojava, women have a significantly enhanced role in comparison with the rest of the Middle East. And one of the most inspiring things that I've seen in recent years has been the role of the women's units in the fight against ISIS. So absolutely, women will play a key role in the liberation of the Kurdish people, and indeed the liberation of the Middle East.
As you know, during the pandemic, Turkish government and the AKP has signed a new law in the parliament that says free the most dangerous criminals, organized criminals in Turkey. But when we look at the general picture, we can still see the journalists, the MPs are still being detained, prison. So can you see? Can you say that Turkey is a democratic state?
Well, it clearly isn't a democratic state, and it's clear that Erdogan is increasingly trying to develop his power. As I said earlier, I think in some ways that's a weakness, because he's unable to actually engage with any opposition within Turkey. But I think in terms of how the Kurdish people deal with that problem, I think, again, a mistake would be to try and cozy up to so-called liberal capitalist forces, because the problem is, I think the Kurds are always going to have names thrown at them. They're always going to be called terrorist, because that suits the narrative of Erdogan and the Turkish ruling class. Where the Kurds need to look to is the international labour movement, and increasingly, I think, as Kurdish workers make links with the workers' movement, that will break down the barriers that exist at the moment that some people in the West have towards the Kurds. So, for example, in Hull, in a very practical way, the trade union movement in Hull has now got very close relations with the Kurdish community in Hull. We work together on a whole number of things, but it's not just us over here and the Kurds over there. It's us and the Kurds united as workers working together. So workers can see that the Kurds are just ordinary people like ourselves.
So how can the Kurdish freedom movement deal with the prejudice that surrounds being labeled as a terrorist organization?
Well, I think by doing what you are doing, and that is to increasingly, link up with trade unionists around the world. It's one thing calling the Kurdish the PKK a terrorist organization. It's another thing entirely if they start attacking trade unionists that are part of a wider trade union international. That will be very difficult for the ruling class, but they will try and label you, just as they try and label socialists in this country as being extreme, as not representing British values, and so on and so forth. Socialists are internationalists. We have to look after each other. We have to support each other, and that, I think, is the way to help break down the barrier internationally. But within Turkey, I think that the Kurdish movement there needs to continue to do what it's clearly already doing through initiatives like the HDP party, and that is to find a broader alliance with the Turkish working class. And when the Turkish working class can see that actually the interests of the Kurds are very similar to our interests, because Turkish workers also are oppressed by Erdogan. They are also repressed and attacked. Trade union rights in Turkey are under attack. It's not just the attack on the Kurds. So just imagine the Turkish working class allied with the Kurdish movement, allied with environmental activists in Turkey, allied with the LGBT, the women's movement. If all of that could come together in a party with a socialist program, that would cut across the problems that the Kurds face at the moment in terms of being labelled terrorists.
In Europe and internationally, big campaigns like Freedom for Öcalan campaign and Peace in Kurdistan campaign is growing. So what else needs to be get done for Freedom for Öcalan campaign?
I think all of those campaigns in their own way can all help. You know, the more campaigns there are, the better. But as a socialist, I think that the power rests with the labour and trade union movement, and I think it's important that those campaigns, many of them already orientated towards the trade unions, but they are the natural allies of the Kurdish people, and it will be them, I think, that will be able to provide the material support, you know, for the Kurdish people in forcing the release of Ocalan at some point in the future.
Mike Whale, Secretary of the whole branch of the Socialist Party, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for supporting our channel.
It's been a pleasure, and best of luck in the future.
Thank you. Thanks.